Why does Frances matter so much in this? Because within the Swaggart ministry, Frances is more than a first lady. She is a strategist, a voice of authority, and the one person Jimmy Swaggart has always leaned on when controversy strikes. Frances's shadow over the narrative. But here's the twist. Gary Wilkerson has now stepped forward to claim that his father's statements were misinterpreted, taken out of context, and weaponized in ways David himself never intended. On one side, the Wilkerson legacy, rooted in street-level ministry, prophetic warnings, and uncompromising holiness. There comes a time when silence becomes agreement, Gary reportedly said, and I cannot allow my father's legacy to be defined by a misunderstanding. The clash of titans. When David Wilkerson's alleged words about spectacle spread, Frances made sure her followers remembered. Even in recent years, she would subtly allude to those voices of criticism that didn't understand the unique calling of the Swaggart platform. Frances, ever the sharp defender of her husband, never forgot these words. Over the years, she would reference men who misunderstood the calling of televangelism, and insiders believed she was pointing directly at David Wilkerson. Gary breaks his silence. In a recent gathering at Colorado Springs, where Gary pastors and leads World Challenge, the ministry founded by his father, he addressed the lingering controversy head-on. With conviction in his voice, he declared, "To understand the magnitude of Gary's statement, one must return to the roots. David Wilkerson was no ordinary preacher. Known for his uncompromising sermons about holiness, repentance, and the dangers of compromise, he was often regarded as a prophetic voice of correction within the church. For decades, whispers, rumors, and unspoken tensions have floated around the Christian world about one of the most unexpected clashes in modern church history. The quiet but undeniable rift between the late evangelist David Wilkerson, the man who shook New York City with his ministry teen challenge and his legendary book The Cross and the Switchblade, and the formidable Frances Swaggart, wife of televangelist Jimmy Swaggart, and a woman often described as the iron backbone of the Swaggart empire. These words landed like a thunderclap. For decades, Frances and her supporters had painted David as a stern critic, almost an enemy of the Swaggart ministry. But Gary's statement flipped the narrative.
Gary Wilkerson finally responds to Frances Swaggart, clears his father David's name. Part 1.
On the other, the Swaggart dynasty, a massive televangelism machine powered by media, music, and Frances's behind-the-scenes brilliance. This single line has already begun to trend across Christian forums, sparking fiery debates between those who see Gary as a peacemaker and those who believe he is reopening old wounds. When these two legacies collided, sparks were inevitable, but with Gary stepping into the light, it seems the battle is no longer whispered about in corners. It is front-page news. At its heart, this is not just a family drama, it's a clash of two empires. But Gary's defense of his father paints a different picture. Maybe David's critique wasn't about tearing anyone down, but about preserving integrity in a time when televangelism was falling into public disgrace. For years, no one dared to put words to what really happened. Both camps, the Wilkerson family and the Swaggart dynasty, maintained their silence. David Wilkerson, who passed away in 2011, took many secrets to his grave. Frances, still active and fiercely protective of her husband's ministry, never missed an opportunity to remind her followers of certain warnings David once made, statements that, according to her, questioned the integrity and methods of the Swaggarts. The burning question is, why did Gary wait this long to respond? My father was a man of deep conviction, but he was also deeply misunderstood. Many of the things attributed to him about the Swaggarts were not statements of condemnation, but warnings rooted in love for the church. It breaks my heart to see those words twisted into an attack against Frances or her family. Let it be clear, my father did not despise them. He was burdened, not bitter. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, when scandals surrounded televangelists, whispers grew that David had expressed serious concerns about the Swaggart empire. According to multiple sources, David reportedly warned close associates that the spectacle of ministry could swallow the heart of the gospel. A thinly veiled critique many assumed was directed toward Jimmy and Frances Swaggart, the shadow of a father's words. Why now? Sources close to the Wilkerson family suggest that Gary had long chosen silence out of respect for both his father's memory and the Swaggart family's influence. But as whispers grew louder, as Frances reportedly continued to keep David's name in conversations, Gary felt compelled to act. But now, after years of silence, the moment has arrived. Gary Wilkerson, David's only son, has spoken out. And his words, they are shaking the very ground beneath Pentecostal history. The first wave of Gary Wilkerson's statement spread like wildfire. Within hours, Christian forums, social media pages, and YouTube commentary channels picked it up. Some praised Gary for finally breaking his silence, others accused him of rewriting history. But Gary was not finished. What he revealed next would not only clear his father's name but also put the spotlight directly back on Frances Swaggart, the woman who had carried David Wilkerson's shadow in her ministry narratives for decades. A son's burden. For Gary Wilkerson, this wasn't just about church politics or old rivalries. It was about something deeper, the weight of being David Wilkerson's son. "Everywhere I go," Gary said in his message, "I am asked about my father's warnings. People assume he hated the Swaggarts, that he condemned them outright. That is not the truth. My father loved the church more than his own reputation. He spoke warnings not out of anger but out of grief, and if those words have been used against Frances, it was never his intent." The crowd sat in stunned silence. For years, Frances had pointed to David as a stern critic. But here was his own son, saying the criticism was not born of bitterness. It was born of love. The letters that changed everything. To strengthen his defense, Gary did something no one expected. He produced old letters and sermon notes from his father's personal archives. One letter, written in the late 1980s, read, "My heart is heavy for those in public ministry. The temptations are strong, and the scrutiny is relentless. I pray for Jimmy and Frances, that God would shield them, for the glare of the spotlight can destroy even the purest intentions." Another note from a sermon draft said, "We must guard ourselves against spectacle, but let it be known, this is not directed at one man or family. It is the state of the church at large." The revelation was explosive. If authentic, these documents proved that David's concern was not aimed solely at the Swaggarts, but at the entire wave of televangelism sweeping America at the time. Frances's silence, or strategy. So far, Frances Swaggart has not made a direct statement in response to Gary's words, but those who know her best believe she is not the type to stay silent forever. Frances is a strategist, a woman who has spent her life carefully protecting Jimmy's legacy and the massive ministry they built together. For decades, whenever David Wilkerson's name came up, she had a way of turning it into a lesson. Some people will never understand our calling. But now, with Gary dismantling the narrative that David was her accuser, Frances faces a dilemma. If she stays silent, it may look like she was wrong all along. If she speaks, she risks igniting a firestorm that could expose even more of the past. The congregation reacts. At Family Worship Center in Baton Rouge, where Frances and Jimmy still hold sway, whispers have already begun. Longtime members who remember the late 1980s scandals are suddenly asking new questions. Was David Wilkerson really against us, or have we misunderstood all this time? Meanwhile, at World Challenge, Gary's congregation has rallied around him. Members described his message as one of healing and restoration. One member said, "This wasn't about attacking Frances. This was about giving us the truth, that David's legacy is one of love, not condemnation." A clash of legacies. At its core, this controversy is more than just personal differences. It is about how two very different ministries shaped modern Christianity. David Wilkerson's legacy, street-level evangelism, personal holiness, and prophetic warnings. His ministry always emphasized humility, repentance, and staying far from the temptations of power and money. The Swaggart dynasty, a televangelism powerhouse, with Frances running the strategy and Jimmy as the charismatic face. Their ministry thrived on visibility, broadcasting faith to millions of homes around the world. When those two legacies collided, misunderstanding was inevitable. David saw danger in the spotlight. Frances saw the spotlight as a calling. Gary's intervention now reframes the entire conflict. Maybe David and Frances weren't enemies. Maybe they simply lived in different visions of what ministry should be. The global reaction. Internationally, Christian leaders have started weighing in. Some agree with Gary, saying David was always misunderstood. Others stand with Frances, insisting that David's warnings were clearly meant as rebuke. A pastor from South Africa wrote online, "This is not about who was right or wrong. It is about how history remembers them." Gary has reminded us that legacies can be distorted if the truth is not defended. Meanwhile, Frances supporters accuse Gary of trying to rewrite history to protect his father's reputation at the expense of hers. What does this mean for the future? The big question remains, what happens now? Will Frances address Gary's revelations head-on in one of her broadcasts? Will the Swaggart ministry quietly distance itself from mentioning David Wilkerson altogether? Will Gary continue to release more documents, perhaps sermons or private notes, to further strengthen his father's name? One thing is certain, this story is far from over. The emotional climax. As Gary ended his message, his voice reportedly broke with emotion. He said, "If my father were here today, he would not want division. He would not want his words used as a weapon against Frances or anyone else. He would want us to seek Christ, above personalities, above empires, above ministries. My plea is simple, let us honor his memory by pursuing unity, not conflict." The crowd wept. For a moment it felt like decades of bitterness were being healed. But, as history has shown, when it comes to the Swaggart family, healing rarely comes without another battle. Final thoughts. This controversy reveals something deeper than a clash between Frances and Gary. It reveals the fragility of legacies. Words spoken decades ago can be twisted, misused, and weaponized, until a son burdened with the truth steps forward to set the record straight. Now the Christian world waits. Will Frances fight, or will this be the first step toward rewriting one of the most misunderstood chapters in church history? Either way, the silence has been broken, and the world will never see David Wilkerson's name the same way again. When Frances didn't immediately respond, rumors exploded. Some believed she was holding back, planning a sharp and devastating reply on Frances and Friends, her long-running broadcast. Others thought she had decided to let the storm pass, knowing from experience that news cycles die down quickly. But insiders whispered that behind closed doors, Frances was furious. One ministry worker allegedly said, "Frances feels betrayed. She believes Gary is trying to rewrite history and tarnish the warnings David himself once gave. She may be quiet in public, but make no mistake, she is not ignoring this." If that's true, Frances could be preparing for a counter-narrative, perhaps digging up her own archive of recordings or private conversations that would portray David in a less forgiving